A few years ago, my family and I were in Swanee while I was working on my D-Min. I drove back one Sunday morning to Florence to do the service that morning. And while driving, I noticed a couple church signs along the road that I thought summed up what our readings tell us this morning. One sign read, "There are always two sides to the story." And the other sign read, "America is free, and so is salvation." Now, this was in late June, close to the 4th of July, which is why I'm sure it said America is free, but that's not the part that interested me. It was the part that said, "And so is salvation." This morning we hear two sides of a story, and we hear about salvation. It might not seem like it at first, but the gospel and the Old Testament actually do work together, and one of the ways has to do with persecution. A fine topic on this Father's Day, I know, but a timely one as well. I think you can understand how persecution plays into the gospel. Jesus, in this missional discourse, is telling the disciples what they need to do to carry on Christ's mission in the world once he is gone. This is right before his trial and crucifixion. And he has already said to them, "You will be persecuted because of me." So I think we can understand it here. But what about in Genesis? Well, as the sign said, there are two sides to the story. Who is being persecuted in this story, or who has been persecuted in this story? It's an intricate story, isn't it? Last week we heard of the joy and salvation given to Abraham and Sarah. They got the salvation they were hoping for through a son, and Isaac was born. But today the tables are turned, literally, for the one who was experiencing salvation is now the one persecuting others. Sarah, and by default Abraham, now persecute Hagar and Ishmael. They become opponents of God. And I know that that seems hard to believe, that Abraham, the one chosen by God, the one through whom the promise is to be fulfilled, could actually be against God. But he is here in a way, because he and Sarah persecute others. The one who just had joy now looks with contempt on another. And why? Why? Sarah sees Isaac playing with Ishmael, or the other way around, Ishmael playing with Isaac. Ishmael is probably 14 years old at this point, and she didn't like it. She becomes worried about her own family, her own history, and she wants Hagar thrown out. But Abraham doesn't want to do that. He's a little hesitant. He says, "I'm not sure I want to do that," because he's worried about his own child, both of them actually. And this is quite a turn for Abraham. If we go back a few chapters in Genesis, back to chapter 16, when Sarah freely gives her servant Hagar to Abraham to be his wife, Hagar conceives and bears Ishmael. And then Sarah feels Hagar is looking upon her with contempt, and she wants her thrown out. And Abraham is quick to say, "She's your servant. Do with her what you want." But now that he's got more of a stake in it, suddenly he's not sure. But God says, "Do what Sarah tells you to do, and it will be okay. Hagar and the boy will be fine. Salvation will still come. Salvation will be offered freely to all." At first hearing, you might think salvation is offered to Isaac and Abraham and to that side of the story. But in this case, salvation is also offered to the one to whom we might not expect it. God hears the cries of Ishmael. God hears the cries of Hagar, and salvation is given. Jesus gives us a similar assurance in our gospel today about salvation, saying that if we work hard and do what we're called to do, we will get salvation. It will be given to us. But at what cost? Many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with the book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship. This gospel is partly where that comes from. Discipleship does have a cost. Jesus very clearly says, "You will be persecuted because of me." And today, when he says, "Take up your cross," he literally means, be willing to die for me and for the sake of my work and my mission on earth. Now, persecution is not always going to go to that extreme. There are other ways of being persecuted or persecuting others that don't lead to death, but persecution just the same. There is a cost to being a disciple of Christ, but the reward is salvation. Now back to the sign again. There are two sides to every story. It's interesting when you look at the Genesis story and the irony there. Here we have an Egyptian woman who is the servant of a Hebrew woman, of an Israelite woman, and she gets cast out into the wilderness not knowing what would happen, and yet salvation comes. And in just a few chapters, as we move into the book of Exodus, we'll hear of the Israelites, now servants to the Egyptians, getting cast out into the wilderness, not knowing what would happen, and yet salvation comes. It's interesting to see how the story twists around like that. Remember, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, were great in Egypt because of Joseph and how he had saved the people during the famine. But time went on and the story wasn't told, and people didn't remember. Then there comes a Pharaoh who didn't know about Joseph, and the story changes. There are always two sides to the story, and salvation is free. I want to talk about a different story. In this story, there are two sides to a street. I joined with several others from the Cathedral to participate in an event Friday night on Juneteenth called Pray on Troost. About 17 of us stood together along Troost at 63rd, and I'm sure there were many more of you who were there standing in different places along Troost, but we all joined with countless others to pray. That's what we did. We prayed. People from all over the metro area were asked to come and stand along a little over a 10-mile stretch of road that for this city symbolizes division and persecution. We stood along the east side of the street only, a powerful statement of where that line was drawn. We were asked to wear a mask and to stand 6 feet apart, but still, even distanced, we formed a little more than a 10-mile prayer chain. We were also asked to put a piece of tape on our mask with one word written on it, a word we wanted to add to this lifting up of those who for too long have been persecuted and looked on with contempt and cast out, not knowing what would happen. The word was love, hope, peace, unity, respect, forgive, heal, and so many more. It was a powerful event. And it was like a parade of sorts. For that hour, cars were going up and down Troost, honking horns and flashing peace signs. I even recognized some of the cars as they went past us and turned around and came back the other way to drive the entire length of that route. And we stood there in prayer, lining the east side of Troost and showing love and respect for all those who have lived in fear and persecution for too long. It was simply amazing. The group I was with was on a corner right by a traffic light, so periodically cars would be stopped there and we could talk with the people in the cars. And I saw a genuine sense of joy and happiness. People were thanking us, and not just those of us standing there, but people all up and down the entire route. People were thanking us for being there, thanking us for showing up and offering our prayers and support, thanking us for saying Black Lives Matter. I didn't get to drive up and down Troost that night, but for those who did, they saw people of all races and colors standing together for that long stretch to say, we are with you and we love you. Some of the people in the cars who had driven along the whole road seemed amazed. It just goes on and on, they said. Sometimes it just takes showing up and being there. Prayers were heard that night and continue to be heard. There is a cost, has been a cost, paid by too many for too long, but salvation comes, has come, and will continue to come. It's not for us to decide, though. It's not in our hands, but in God's hands. God's reward to give freely to all. I heard that similar events took place in other cities along their own versions of Troost Avenue. All kinds of people came together to say there are two sides to a street, but that shouldn't divide us. There are two sides to a story, but that night and from now on, our stories should be one. A story of love and hope and peace and unity and respect and forgiveness and healing. A story that has had a cost, but a story that will lead to salvation.